My name is Dr. Hannah Cobb and I am a senior lecturer in archaeology at the University of Manchester. I do a whole series of different things as an archaeologist. I'm particularly interested in contemporary archaeological practice and equality and diversity issues. I'm also really interested in prehistory and particularly the Mesolithic and the Neolithic periods, and particularly the Mesolithic is the last hunter-gatherers, sort of before people started farming. And that's what I'm going to talk to you a bit about today under the guise of a title called The Prehistory of Herne the Hunter. Because, of course, the other thing that I am is a massive fan of the Box of Delights. I am part of the generation that watched it on telly when it was first shown in 1984. And I don't know whether it's part of the reason why I'm an archaeologist, but it's certainly the sort of imagery of the Box of Delights has certainly fed into my interests in the past and prehistory. So when I read the box and watch the Box of Delights, there's all sorts of things I think about from prehistory. And I guess today I want to share just a little bit of that with you. I'm on the website, on the Facebook page as Hannah Westaway, which is my secret other name. It's not a secret, but that's my other name. So you might recognise me from there under that name, but my professional name is Hannah Cobb. I feel a little bit like being Abner Brown and the Reverend Dr. Bottledale, but I'm not a baddie, I promise you. So I'll stop waffling on about this and I'll get into the talk. But if you have any questions or anything, please do feel free to drop me an email or I'm on Twitter as well. So let's get into it. So I mentioned that I'm going to be talking about British prehistory, and I thought it'd be helpful just to give you a little bit of a sense of what I'm talking about. So prehistory, of course, is the bit before text was invented. And in terms of British prehistory, we have the Upper Paleolithic, so the Old Stone Age is what Paleolithic translates to in Britain, and we're really talking in this period about sort of the period of time in the last ice age. And then, and where everyone was hunting and gathering. Then we get the Mesolithic, which dates sort of from about 9,600 BC to about 4,000 BC, and we're talking about there at the end of the last ice age, and the hunter-gatherers that lived in Britain at the end of the last ice age and before the start of farming. And so Mesolithic means the Middle Stone Age. Then from about 4,000 BC, you get the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, and that's when you get the first farming societies coming in, and that lasts for a couple of thousand years. Then people start to do metalworking, first of all experimenting with bronze, and so we get the Bronze Age, and that's when society becomes much more hierarchical. So that's sort of starts at about 2,400 BC. And then from about 800 BC, you get the Iron Age, where metalworking becomes much more ubiquitous in daily life, where society becomes much more sort of stratified and sort of much more hierarchical, and we get sort of the start of sort of large settlements and large sort of regional identities and things like that. And I've put it ends AD 43-ish. That's an ish for sure, because really we're talking about here when the Romans come in, and of course Iron Age, so Celtic populations mix with the Roman populations, and so there isn't really a kind of defined end in a nice, neat, easy way, but the date that the Romans come in is often given as the end of the Iron Age. And there's so much that one could talk about in terms of the prehistory of Herne the Hunter. And in fact, Herne the Hunter's first appearance is in the Upper Paleolithic. So if I do that, you might well be familiar with this picture. So this is probably the first appearance of an antler-clad being. So we could say that's Herne the Hunter. We don't really know because there's no text. This is the first appearance, though, in any kind of art or representational form of an antler-clad being. This image comes from the cave of the Trois Frères, the three brothers from Ariège in France, and it was made around 13,000 BC. And you can see on the left-hand side of this slide at the top, that's the original image. And then the one that's more famous is the sketch that was done in the 1950s of it by Henri Breuil. And you can see that the sketch makes it a lot more man with antlers, makes it a lot more Herne the Hunter-like than perhaps the original drawing really is. So I could focus on that, but that's largely the maximum amount of evidence that we've got for a kind of Herne the Hunterness from the Paleolithic. So I'm not going to linger there. I could instead pick up the story of Herne the Hunter in the Neolithic, and this would certainly chime in with the Box of Delights and the focus of the Box of Delights on the winter solstice, because the Neolithic is really the first time that archaeologically we can see a veneration of the solstices. So obviously Stonehenge is a very famous site that where the summer sunrise, the summer solstice sunrise is important, but there's also a variety of different chamber tombs which have sort of light boxes, and on either the longest or the shortest day of the year the sun will shine in, either the setting sun or the rising sun will shine in through these light boxes. So I could focus on the Neolithic, but there's not so much to do with deer in the Neolithic. People were just starting to do farming and they really weren't so fussed with deer. I could pick up the story of Herne the Hunter in the Iron Age, and I think this is really where the imagery of a horned being really picks up. And I had a picture of Stonehenge just in case you weren't sure of it. There's what Stonehenge looks like, very pretty. And so in the Iron Age, this is where really we start getting quite a lot of artwork and iconography about horned beings. So what you can see in this picture is the Gunderstrop cauldron, which comes from mid-Germany, and it dates to about 100 years BC, 100 BC. Throughout sort of Iron Age and Celtic art, you get the identification of Cernunnos, this kind of horned being, in all sorts of art. Cernunnos is identified by name in a carving from the 1st century AD in the middle of France. And by this point we get to the point where Roman writings on Celtic beliefs, and then later Celtic oral traditions that get written down, and so things like the Ulster cycle. So we can really start to build up a picture of the mythology and the beliefs behind Herne the Hunter. But obviously this takes us beyond prehistory into a time of writing. And so what I want to do is take us back a little bit further, and I want to take us back to the period where I think we can trace something of the Box of Delights Herne the Hunter in the archaeological record in detail for the first time. And so in this talk I want to concentrate on the second period on this little timeline, that's the Mesolithic, and the fascinating archaeology of the Mesolithic period. So before we start to trace Herne the Hunter, it's probably worth setting the scene a little bit and explaining just a little bit about the British Mesolithic. It differs from the Paleolithic before it because this is a period of fundamental environmental change. So this is a period where the sea level is rising, so it's the end of the Ice Age, and all the water that had been locked up in the Ice Age melts, and so sea levels rise. This is the point where Britain gets cut off as an island. Previously it was connected to the continent. It's the time when woodland expands across the UK. The wild wood that Herne the Hunter refers to in the Box of Delights expands across the UK, and we get an expansion of mixed woodland. Originally it sort of starts off as kind of like, a glacial tundra, and then the woodland spreads across the UK. Obviously things like the glacial megafauna, late Pleistocene megafauna, like woolly mammoths and things, they've all died out before this period. And instead hunter-gatherers start to hunt things like red deer, and develop, continue to hunt things like red deer and boar, and they develop precision hunting tools. And so particularly the Mesolithic is characterised by a type of tool that's known as a microlith. So at this point, if you think people didn't have metal tools, their predominant tool type was stone tools, and so they made these tiny microliths, as you can see in the bottom left. You can see how small they are there on someone's finger, and these were made out of flint, and then they would have hafted these within wood or bone or antler in order to make all sorts of different tools, so projectile points, arrows, harpoon type points, all of these kind of things. And also microliths would also have been great as graters as well, so they weren't just for hunting, they were also for processing plants. So you might feel that at this point that I've led you a bit of a merry dance, and that I've said I was going to talk about the prehistory of Herne the Hunter, but in fact I'm just giving you facts about a period in the past for which you perhaps have no interest at all. But I think it's in this period that we can see a really boxy iteration of Herne the Hunter developing. And in particular, I want to pick up on the first magical time that Kay enters the Box of Delights and use this as a way to trace the evidence of Herne the Hunter in the Mesolithic, and think about the transformation of Herne and Kay as deer and birds and fish, and how this relates to the archaeological record. So this whole scene in the book, I'm sure you're familiar with it. This is the point where Kay finally gets a chance, when he's received the Box of Delights, to sit down and look at it. And so he goes under the valance of his dressing table at Sea King's and opens it. "I say," Kay said to himself, "this is a wonderful box. Now I'll open it." He pressed the tiny golden rosebud, and at once from within the box there came a tiny crying of birds. Inside he saw what he took to be a book, the leaves of which were all chased and worked with multitudinous figures, and the effect that it gave him was that of staring into an open wood. So please step into the wildwood with me, and let's turn first to the evidence of Herne as we see him most clearly in the box, and perhaps throughout the rest of time, in his form as a figure who is at once a man but also very much a stag. So here's perhaps the most important passage to do with Herne the Hunter in the whole book. This is where we really meet him and see him for the first time. At first, he thought that the figure was one of those giant red deer, long since extinct. It bore enormous antlers. Then he saw that it was a great man, antlered at the brow, dressed in deerskin and moving with the silent, slow grace of a stag. Kay knew at once that this was Herne the Hunter, of whom he'd so often heard. "Ha, Kay," Herne said, "are you coming into my wild wood?" So this whole description of Herne and the garb that he's wearing itself comes from the Mesolithic period. And in fact, at the amazingly well-preserved early Mesolithic site of Star Carr in North Yorkshire, excavations in the 1950s found 21 antler frontlets, and then it's been excavated more recently in the last decade by the University of York and my colleagues at the University of Manchester, and they found a whole series more of these amazing antler frontlets. They were initially interpreted, when they were excavated in the 1950s, as disguises. So you can see this antler frontlet on the left hand side, and what we're talking about is part of the red deer skull with the antlers attached to it, and then these have been sort of hollowed and smoothed in on the inside, and holes drilled into the kind of front of them, and then also the antlers themselves in many of the cases have been split or worn down, and effectively so it would be lighter to wear. You could imagine how heavy it would be to wear if it was sort of the full weight of the antlers. And so the initial interpretations of these when the site was excavated was that these might have been hunting disguises, that hunters would simply put these masks on, put them on like masks, so that red deer wouldn't spot them and they'd be able to get closer to them and hunt them more effectively. And obviously this is sort of a good practical solution, but since they were initially found, there's been quite a lot of work done looking at ethnographic studies, so studies of contemporary or recent hunter-gatherer populations, particularly sort of hunter-gatherers within the Arctic Circle, so people like the Khanty, and all of those ethnographic studies show that in these kind of cultures, it's not just the case when people are hunting of wanting to disguise themselves, but often hunters perform really sort of detailed rituals in which they aim to transform their whole being. They aim to transform themselves into deer. And this, to me, feels so fundamentally boxy and very much like Herne the Hunter. And so there's been quite a lot of work on this recently. My colleague Chantal Canella wrote an article called Becoming Deer in the Mesolithic, where she pointed to all of this different ethnographic evidence and talked about sort of the evidence for how people might have undertaken sort of effectively shamanic magic in order to transform themselves and to take on the essences and the sort of power of deer in order to then be able to hunt them and to sort of have their characteristics. And then more recently, there's a really interesting article by Little et al, where they've done a little bit of experimental archaeology on the more recent around the more recent frontlet finds, and also have sort of pointed to this kind of shamanic transformative idea. And I'll put links to both of those articles in the description below this video. So I think this is a really fantastic example, and Star Carr was a really incredible site. The preservation there is amazing, but obviously these frontlets are something that we just don't get anywhere else in the British or the European Mesolithic. So something really spectacular was going on here. But actually, antler frontlets are really important throughout the British and European Mesolithic. Before we come to that, here's this next quote from the scene in the book. Now, next to being a jockey, Kay had longed to be a young stag. Now he realised that he had become one. He was there in the green wood beside a giant stag, so screened with the boughs that they were a part of the dappled pattern of light and shade, and the news of the wood came to him upon the scents of the wind. This quote really makes me think about that kind of transformative hunting magic that might have taken place in the Mesolithic, where one didn't just disguise oneself as a deer, but one became a deer, a stag, and became screened and smelt the wood and felt the wood in the way that the deer that you were hunting may well have done. And as I said before, the cosmological significance of red deer clearly existed throughout the Mesolithic. There's quite a lot of evidence for red deer being used elsewhere. If not in the form of frontlets, the antlers still retain significance. So I should have said that for the Mesolithic, there isn't actually really much evidence, skeletal evidence. People in the Mesolithic were not normally buried. Other things were happening with bodies in the Mesolithic, and we'll come on to that shortly. And so there's a couple of Mesolithic cemeteries, not in Britain actually, but elsewhere in Europe, and they're really important sites, therefore, for getting a glimpse into kind of Mesolithic belief systems. And in almost all of them, the very few full burials that there are have red deer antlers either behind the head of the deceased or sort of under their shoulders, and it's particularly the antlers particularly seem to be used with more elderly individuals, so people elderly for the Mesolithic, so people who are sort of 40 and above. You also get red deer teeth alongside boar teeth being used as pendants, and obviously we can't see them as pendants. The twine that they would have been on is no longer preserved, but the placing of them around bodies suggests that they were either pendants or headdresses or part of some form of clothing and decoration. You also get red deer antlers used throughout time as well, throughout life as well, as tools. And on the top left, you can see carved antlers that have been used as harpoons and projectile points. So again, this is perhaps the power of Herne to transform into something else. But what are the rest of this boxy scene? I think this would be a pretty short talk if we stopped here. And so I suggest that we can see the other transformations that Kay and Herne make in this special scene are also present in the Mesolithic. So in the next part of the scene, Herne and Kay transform to become wild duck. Looking through the stalks of the reeds, Kay saw that there were a multitude of wild duck. "Would you like to be a wild duck, Kay?" Herne asked. Now, next to being a jockey and a stag, Kay had longed to be a wild duck, and at once, with a great clatter of feathers, the wild duck rose more and more and more, going high up, and oh joy! Herne and Kay were with them, flying on wings of their own. I love this part, and I actually think perhaps this is the most tenuous part of my narrative about the Mesolithic, because there is only one example of a bird being used in such a way in the Mesolithic, but it's a really beautiful and touching example. So this is the example from the Mesolithic cemetery of Vedbæk in Denmark. This dates to the late Mesolithic, so about 5,600 to 5,000 BC. And here there is a burial where there is an 18-year-old woman sort of late teens woman with a newborn baby, and they're buried together. And the baby itself is laid out on a swan's wing. And so the actual burial is pictured on the left, and there's I don't know if it's exactly a reconstruction of it, but this is an image from the series of Mesolith graphic novels by Ben Haggerty, and the illustration is by Adam Brockbank, and I'll put a link to that again in the description below. So it gives you a bit of a sense of what we might be looking at here. You can see it's not the exact drawing of the burial, because the burial itself wasn't crouched, but it gives you a sense of the swan's wing and what it must have been like to have had an infant laid on this. We can think about the many reasons why that must be. Obviously, you know, we think today in sort of Judeo-Christian traditions of wings and angels and sort of you know, rising to heaven in the afterlife, but we might be looking at something else here perhaps in the Mesolithic as well. It may be a similar kind of principles, this touching gesture. It may also be, though, a similar kind of transformation that we see in the hunting magic, perhaps by bringing in part of this sort of magnificent creature. There is some form of transformation of this woman and her child in death, and perhaps becoming a bird has a sort of deep emotional resonances in this sad and touching scene. But let's leave that, because it's a really sad example, I think, and sad and beautiful. And I want to now move on to think about the next transformation in the scene. So this is where Herne says, "Would you like to be a fish, Kay?" And next to being a jockey, a stag and a wild duck, Kay had always longed to be a fish. And then instantly Kay was a fish. He and Herne were there in the coolness and dimness, wavering as the water wavered, and feeling a cold spring gurgling up and just underneath them and tickling their tummies. So for the Mesolithic, we're talking about a period of 12,000 to 6,000 years ago, and you'd think perhaps the evidence for fishy transformations in the Mesolithic might be quite limited. But in fact, there's some incredible sites that give us real insight into the importance of water and the importance of sea and fish and other sea creatures as well. Some of them come from our own shores, and so the preservation of bone is obviously extremely fragile, and it needs sort of particular conditions in order to be preserved. On the west coast of Scotland, and also in Scandinavia as well, there are a number of Mesolithic sites known as shell middens. Midden is another word for rubbish heap, and so basically these are rubbish heaps full of shells, where hunter-gatherers would have been collecting shells and shellfish as part of their sort of gathering processes, and would have disposed of the waste of those. They repeatedly visited the same place and disposed of their shells and their waste in the same place. And these middens grew over time to be enormous. So on the very tiny, tiny island of Oronsay on the west coast of Scotland, overlooking the island of Jura, there are 5 Mesolithic shell middens. This is one called Castile Nangilian 1, and so this is pictured on the bottom right hand side of the picture. You can see the Paps of Jura in the background. And these must have been really incredible and important sites. These were people who were effectively nomadic. They were moving around the land and the seascape all the time through their life. And they may have stopped and had camps and come back to campsites perhaps on a regular basis. But ultimately, these were moving people who moved around. They didn't build big permanent things. And yet here in the Mesolithic are these big permanent sites. And you can see the size of this shell midden. This is a picture that was taken just before it was excavated in the late 1800s. And you can see the people in front give you a really good sense of the scale of this site. It's about 25 metres wide and 14 metres high, which is really just incredible dimensions when you think that this is just waste that is built up. And there is shellfish waste, but there is also other sorts of waste as well. So they were processing different types of animal remains here. So particularly fish and cetaceans, so dolphins and things like that, and there's a sort of evidence for processing beaver as well, and otters as well here. So there's all sorts of, and seals. So there's all sorts of things going on at this site and at these sites. And one of the other things there is evidence for human remains being included in these sites. Now, I mentioned before that we don't really get many cemeteries, so we don't really get many human remains for the Mesolithic in Europe. And the evidence suggests that really when people died, their bodies were being disposed of in different ways. Perhaps their bodies were being cremated, and then the cremated remains weren't being buried but were being sprinkled somewhere across the landscape, perhaps in water. Perhaps their bodies before were not necessarily just being cremated, but were perhaps being excarnated, and that's where the body is laid out and effectively it's weathered over time, and then the bones are collected up and those are taken somewhere else. And we know that this practice certainly happens in the Neolithic, in the period afterwards, in the first farmers, because the first chambered tombs that we get, the first sort of formal funerary monuments that we get across Britain and Europe, contain bones that have been excarnated and then gathered up in this kind of a way. And in fact, although it's not really the place to get into it, in the Neolithic you also get kind of amalgamations and hybrids where human and animal bodies and body parts are mixed together in these tombs. And perhaps the shell middens that we see in Western Scotland reflect some kind of predecessor to that tradition. At the site of Knockcoig, there was a seal flipper, the bones from a seal flipper, with the bones from a human hand laid on top of that. So there's not only evidence for these midden sites being sites that were repeatedly visited by hunter-gatherers in the landscape over time, but where bodies were, dead bodies were excarnated, and then where perhaps important connections between humans and animals were played out in the way that parts of those bodies were mixed and merged at these important sites. Elsewhere, and not in Britain unfortunately, we get amazing evidence of the importance and perhaps the transformative power of people and fish. So these all come from an amazing site in the Iron Gates Gorge of the Danube. The site's called Lepenski Vir, and it dates to about 6,300 to 5,700 BC. It's in modern day Serbia. These sculptures were all found at Lepenski Vir, and although this is a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer site, there's actually the Mesolithic's quite different in this part of the world, and there are structures here, and these were found within structures and also within burials. So there's a whole series of burials here. They are sort of thought to represent water animals because they've got very fish-like features. They've got fish-like mouths and fish-like scales, and some of them are almost more fish than human, but it's very clear that these aren't quite fish, and they aren't quite human either. Some of them have got arms, and they've got sort of obviously quite anthropomorphized facial features, but also quite fishy facial features as well. And so perhaps what we're seeing here is the transformative importance of fish at this site. And there's been some really interesting interpretations of these sort of composite human fish sculptures, and certainly it seems that the sort of cosmological significance of the Danube was really important. The houses all follow the flow of the Danube, and there seems the burials that are there all seem to follow a specific sort of linear pattern of the flow of the river. And an archaeologist, Dusan Boric, has pointed out that there were a whole series of large fish which would have swum up the Danube to spawn every spring, and he has suggested that in the context of these kind of fish-human sculptures, that these large fish might have been perhaps seen as ancestors or something like that, returning every year. We might think that that's the case, or perhaps we are looking at another kind of Herne the Hunter style transformation, where people, through hunting magic, through fishing magic this time, could transform to become part human, part fish. So we see that Kay meets Herne, they become deer, then they become duck, then they become fish, and then at the end of the scene, the scene finishes. Somehow the figure of Herne, which had been so stag-like, became like the oak tree and merged into the oak tree till Kay could see nothing but the tree. And I suppose we could perhaps also think of, in the Mesolithic, that perhaps plants also had transformative powers. Certainly we know that into the Iron Age and through Celtic mythology, the cosmological and transformative powers of trees and plants is really important, and the roots of this may lie in the Mesolithic. There are a whole series of quite large, well, not a whole series of, there are a couple of really unique and amazing sites from the Mesolithic where there were enormous post holes where enormous trees must have been placed, tree trunks must have been placed deliberately to form perhaps almost kind of like totem pole like structures, but perhaps simply just huge monumental structures. There are some near to Stonehenge, where the Stonehenge visitor centre car park used to be. When that was being built, they found these huge Mesolithic pits that were likely held huge tree trunks. On the other side of the country, in Aberdeenshire, in Deeside at Crathis Castle, there's a whole series of similar huge pits, which are discussed as potentially being the earliest sort of ceremonial site in Britain. And again, they've got a great YouTube channel with loads of stuff about the Mesolithic in the Deeside Mesolithic, and I'll put that in the description as well. On the other side of Scotland, on the island of Colonsay, there is a pit from the sort of earlier part of the Mesolithic at a site called Stowsnake, where there was 250,000 roasted hazelnuts that were buried in a single pit event. So clearly plants had really important and trees had really important symbolism, although it's hard to get at what that symbolism was. And of course, this is a period of time where people didn't have pottery and they didn't have metal. So any of their tools that weren't made out of flint and stone or antler and bone would have been made out of wood, and would have been made or out of natural fibres like nettles in order to make baskets and rope and things like that. So it's not surprising that these may have had some kind of cosmological and transformative significance in the Mesolithic. So this brings us to the end of this scene, of this chapter. And then Kay was himself again under the valance in his room at Seekings, looking at the first page in the box of delights contained within the box. My goodness, Kay said. No wonder the old man treasured this box and called it a box of delights. Now I wonder, he said, how long have I been in that fairyland with Herne the Hunter? He looked at his watch and found that he had been away only 2 minutes. It was now 10 minutes to 11. My goodness, Kay said, all that took only 2 minutes. So I know that this talk hasn't quite taken 2 minutes, perhaps just a little bit longer. And I hope what I've discussed today hasn't seemed like a fairyland to you either, but instead I hope it's provided an opportunity to think through the real prehistoric and particularly Mesolithic evidence of hunter-gatherer transformations, and perhaps some of the roots of the long-standing narrative of Herne the Hunter in British and indeed pan-European mythology. We all read and watch and love the Box of Delights and see so many different things in it. And what I've presented here today is what I see and what I think of when I read and watch this magical sequence. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have been able to share it with you. Thank you very much. Please do drop me a line if you have any questions or any thoughts. Thank you.